My son ordered me to sell my boat repair shop. You're gonna die with the crabs and be a failure forever. I refused, so he cut me off. Years later, a homeless teenager came asking me for a job. He had a familiar face that intrigued me. I asked, "Who's your father, and how old are you?" And his answer revealed a dark secret about my son. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought my own son would look at me with such disgust. But there Philip stood, in his expensive suit and polished shoes, surveying my boat repair shop like it was some kind of disease he might catch. "Dad, this has to stop." His voice carried that tone I'd grown to hate over the years, the one that said he was embarrassed by everything I represented. "You're 61 years old. It's time to sell this place and move on with your life." I wiped my hands on the old rag I kept in my back pocket, the same one I'd been using for the past 15 years. The smell of salt water and engine oil filled the small workspace, a scent that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. This wasn't just a business to me. This was my life, my identity, everything I'd built with my own two hands after coming back from Vietnam with nothing but a Purple Heart and a head full of nightmares. "Philip, we've talked about this before," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not ready to retire. This shop means everything to me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound echoed off the corrugated metal walls of the shop, bouncing back at me like an accusation. "Means everything to you? Look around, Dad. Really look. You're working in a glorified garage, fixing boats for fishermen who can barely afford to pay you. Half your customers pay you in fish instead of actual money." That stung because it was partially true. Old Miguel had brought me a cooler full of red snapper just last week instead of the $200 he owed me for fixing his outboard motor. But I didn't mind. Miguel was a good man and his family needed that money more than I did. Besides, my late wife Maria had always loved fresh fish, and cooking it reminded me of her. "There's nothing wrong with honest work," I said, but Philip was already shaking his head. "Honest work? Dad, you smell like bait and motor oil. Your fingernails are permanently stained black. When was the last time you even wore a clean shirt to dinner?" He gestured at my worn work clothes with obvious disdain. "My kids are ashamed to tell their friends what their grandfather does for a living." Those words hit me harder than any physical blow could have. My grandchildren, Philip's twins, Emma and Jake, both 14, meant the world to me. The thought that they might be ashamed of me made my chest tighten with a pain I hadn't felt since Maria passed away 5 years ago. "That's not true," I whispered, but Philip wasn't finished. "It is true, and you know it. Sarah won't even let them come here anymore because she's afraid they'll get tetanus from all the rusty metal lying around." Philip walked over to my workbench, where I had been rebuilding a carburetor for Mrs. Henderson's fishing boat. He picked up one of my tools with 2 fingers, like it might contaminate him. "This is pathetic, Dad. You're going to die with the crabs and be a failure forever." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush me. I stared at my son, this man I had raised, loved, sacrificed for, and wondered where I had gone wrong. When had he become so cold, so calculating? When had success in his real estate business made him forget where he came from? "Philip," I said slowly, "your mother and I worked 3 jobs each to put you through college. We sold our car so you could have money for books. We ate beans and rice for months so you could afford that business suit for your first job interview. And this shop, this pathetic place, is what paid for all of it." For just a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or shame. But it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "That was different," he said, setting the tool down and brushing his hands together like he was removing dirt. "That was an investment in my future, but this is just you being stubborn and clinging to the past. You need to sell this place, take the money, and buy a nice condo in one of those retirement communities. Play golf, take up painting, do something respectable for once in your life." "And if I refuse?" Philip straightened his tie and looked me dead in the eye. "Then we're done, Dad. I won't have my children exposed to this anymore. I won't have my business associates wondering why my father chooses to live like some kind of dock rat when he could be living with dignity." The words hung in the air between us, like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. I felt something crack inside my chest, something that might have been my heart or might have been the last connection between me and the son I thought I knew. "So that's it?" I asked. 43 years of being your father, and it all comes down to whether or not I sell my business." "It comes down to whether or not you care enough about your family to stop embarrassing us." Philip pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. "I have a showing in 20 minutes. Give me an answer, Dad. Are you going to sell, or am I going to have to explain to Emma and Jake why they can't see their grandfather anymore?" I looked around my shop one more time, at the half-finished boats waiting for my attention, at the photographs of satisfied customers hanging on the wall. At the small shrine to Maria I kept on my desk, complete with the plastic flowers she'd loved so much. This wasn't just a business. This was the place where I'd rebuilt myself after the war, where I'd found purpose again, where I'd made a life worth living. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not selling." Philip nodded like he'd expected that answer, like he'd been hoping for it even. "Then I guess we have nothing more to talk about." He walked toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Just before he reached it, he turned back one last time. "When you're lying in this place, dying alone, surrounded by nothing but rust and regret, remember that you chose this over your own family." The door slammed shut behind him, and I was alone with the sound of my own breathing and the distant cry of seagulls outside. I sank into the old chair behind my desk, the one with the broken spring that Maria had always nagged me to replace, and tried to understand what had just happened. My son had just cut me out of his life, and by extension cut me off from my grandchildren, because I wouldn't abandon the one thing that still gave my life meaning. The cruelest part was that I could see his point in a way. The shop wasn't much to look at. I wasn't getting any younger. Maybe it was time to hang up my tools and fade quietly into whatever passed for a golden years these days. But every time I thought about selling, I remembered the look on Miguel's face when I got his boat running again. I remembered Mrs. Henderson crying with relief when I fixed her late husband's fishing boat for a fraction of what the fancy marina would have charged. I remembered all the young people I'd taught basic engine repair to over the years, watching their faces light up when they finally understood how things worked. This wasn't just about money or business. This was about having a purpose, about still mattering in a world that seemed determined to push old men like me aside. As I sat there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds of my life's work, I made a decision. Philip might be ashamed of me, but I wasn't ashamed of myself. I had built something good here, something that mattered to people who needed it. I wasn't ready to give that up, even if it cost me everything else. I just didn't know then that everything else was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. 3 years passed like a slow tide, each day blending into the next in the familiar rhythm of work that had become both my salvation and my prison. The silence from Philip and his family was complete, absolute. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no awkward holiday visits. It was as if I had simply ceased to exist in their world the moment I chose my boat shop over their approval. The loneliness was the hardest part. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone. I'd grown comfortable with my own company, but the particular ache that comes from knowing your own blood has written you off as worthless. Some nights I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to call Philip, to tell him I'd changed my mind, that I'd sell the shop and move into one of those sterile retirement communities where old men go to wait for death. But then morning would come, and I'd see the sunrise reflecting off the water, smell the salt air mixed with engine oil, and remember why this place mattered to me. Business had actually picked up in recent months. Word had spread among the local fishing community that I was fair, honest, and didn't charge city prices for country work. I'd hired Tom Brennan, a retired mechanic who needed something to keep his hands busy, and together we'd been handling more repairs than I'd seen in years. The irony wasn't lost on me that Philip's prediction about me dying alone and broke was proving to be spectacularly wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when my life took another unexpected turn. The autumn air carried that particular chill that warned of winter coming, and I was hunched over the engine of a 30-foot sport fisher when I heard footsteps approaching. I assumed it was Tom coming back from his coffee break, but when I looked up, I saw a kid standing in the doorway of the shop. He couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, but something about the way he carried himself made him seem older. His clothes were clean but worn thin, the kind of careful cleanliness that comes from having very little and taking care of what you have. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, and his brown eyes held a wariness that reminded me of stray dogs who'd learned not to trust easily. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that he was trying hard to hide. "I was wondering if you might have any work available. I don't need much pay, just enough to get by, and I'm willing to learn whatever you need me to learn." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my rag out of habit. There was something about this kid that struck me immediately. Not just his obvious need, but something deeper. The way he stood straight despite his circumstances, the way he looked me directly in the eye when he spoke, the careful politeness that suggested someone had raised him right before life knocked him down. "What's your name, son?" I asked. "Jake, sir. Jake Morrison." "Well, Jake Morrison, I appreciate you asking, but I've got to be honest with you. This isn't exactly a high-paying operation here. I can barely afford to keep Tom on part-time as it is." Jake's shoulders sagged slightly, but he didn't look away. "I understand, sir. I just thought I'd ask. I've been looking for work for a while now, and someone at the diner said you were a fair man who might give someone a chance." Something in his tone made me study him more carefully. "Where are you staying, Jake?" He hesitated, and I saw a flush of embarrassment color his cheeks. "I've got a place," he said carefully, which I recognized as the kind of non-answer someone gives when they don't want to admit they're sleeping rough. "Have you eaten today?" Another hesitation. "I'm fine, sir. I'm not asking for charity. I just want to work." That pride, that determination not to be pitied, it reminded me of myself at his age, fresh back from Vietnam with nothing but stubborn refusal to give up. Something about Jake pulled at memories I thought I'd buried, of being young and desperate and too proud to admit just how desperate I really was. "Tell you what," I said, making a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. "I could use someone to help organize parts, clean up around here, maybe learn some basic maintenance. It's not glamorous work, and I can't pay much. Maybe $60 a day to start, but it's honest work, if you're interested." Jake's face lit up, like I'd just offered him a fortune instead of what amounted to barely minimum wage. "Yes, sir, absolutely. When can I start?" "Right now, if you want, but first, when was the last time you had a real meal?" "Sir, I told you, I'm not asking for—" "I know what you told me. I'm asking when you last ate." Jake looked down at his worn sneakers. "Yesterday morning, but I'm okay. I can work just fine." I shook my head and walked over to the small refrigerator I kept in the corner of the shop. Maria had always packed enough lunch for 3 people, a habit I'd maintained even after she was gone. I pulled out 2 sandwiches and handed one to Jake. "Rule number 1 around here," I said. "Nobody works hungry. Eat that, then we'll get you started." Jake took the sandwich with hands that trembled slightly, whether from hunger or emotion I couldn't tell. He unwrapped it carefully like he was handling something precious and took a bite. I watched his face relax as he chewed, saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. "This is really good," he said. "Thank you." My late wife's recipe. She always said the secret to a good sandwich was to make it with love, even if you're just making it for yourself. As Jake ate, I found myself studying his profile. There was something familiar about him that I couldn't quite place. Something about the shape of his jaw or the way he held his head when he was concentrating. It was probably nothing, just the kind of déjà vu that happens when you reach my age and start seeing ghosts of the past in every young face you encounter. "So, Jake," I said, settling into my desk chair, "tell me a bit about yourself. Where are you from?" "Originally from up north near Jacksonville. Been down here about 6 months." "Family?" Jake's expression tightened. My mom passed away last year. Cancer. After that, things got complicated. I decided it was time to make my own way. The careful way he said complicated told me there was more to the story, but I didn't press. Everyone deserves their privacy, especially kids who've been knocked around by life. I'm sorry about your mother, I said. That's hard at any age, but especially when you're young. Jake nodded, taking another bite of his sandwich. She was a good woman, worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after my father, after he wasn't around anymore. She always said I had good hands, that I could fix anything if I put my mind to it. Well, we'll find out if she was right. You ever work on engines before? Some. Nothing as complicated as boat engines, but I helped a neighbor with his car a few times. I like figuring out how things work, how they fit together. As the morning progressed, I showed Jake around the shop, explaining the basics of boat maintenance and repair. He listened with an intensity that reminded me of myself as a young apprentice, asking intelligent questions and remembering everything I told him. When I handed him a wrench and asked him to help me remove a stubborn bolt, his movements were confident and sure. You weren't kidding about having good hands, I said as he managed to loosen a bolt that had been giving me trouble for 20 minutes. Jake smiled, and for a moment the wariness left his eyes completely. Mom always said I got that from my father's side. She said he was good with his hands, too, could build or fix anything. He's not around anymore. The smile faded. No, sir, he left before I was born. Mom never liked to talk about him much, just said he wasn't ready to be a father. Something cold touched the back of my neck, a feeling I couldn't quite identify. There was something about Jake's story that felt significant, somehow. The timeline, the location, even the kids' mannerisms, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that I didn't yet have enough information to solve. Well, I said, pushing the strange feeling aside, his loss is my gain. You're going to work out just fine here, Jake. As the day wore on, I watched Jake work with a mixture of admiration and growing unease. The kid was everything I could have asked for in an assistant, hard-working, respectful, eager to learn. But there was something else, something I couldn't shake. The way he tilted his head when he was concentrating. The particular shade of brown in his eyes. The shape of his hands when he gripped a tool. Small details that individually meant nothing, but together were starting to form a picture that made my chest tight with possibilities I didn't want to consider. By closing time, Jake had proven himself more valuable than any assistant I'd ever had. He'd organized my parts inventory, cleaned areas of the shop that hadn't seen proper attention in months, and shown a natural aptitude for mechanical work that couldn't be taught. Same time tomorrow? He asked as I locked up the shop. Same time tomorrow, I confirmed. And Jake? There's a small apartment above Rosie's diner that she rents out pretty cheap. Clean, safe. If you're interested, I could put in a good word. Jake's eyes brightened. That would be really helpful, sir. Thank you. As I watched him walk away into the gathering dusk, that strange feeling returned stronger than before. There was more to Jake Morrison than met the eye, and something deep in my gut told me that discovering what that was might change everything. I just didn't know yet how right I was, or how much I wasn't prepared for the truth when it finally revealed itself. Jake had been working for me for almost 3 weeks when I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been eating at me since the day he walked into my shop. There was something about him that I couldn't shake. Something that kept me awake at night staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together fragments of memory that didn't quite want to fit together. It was a Friday afternoon, and we were working side by side on the engine of Captain Rodriguez's fishing boat. Jake had proven himself to be not just a willing worker but genuinely gifted with mechanical problems. He could diagnose engine troubles with an instinct that usually took years to develop, and his hands seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply to stubborn bolts without stripping the threads. "Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice casual as I handed him a socket wrench, "you mentioned your father left before you were born. Did your mother ever tell you anything about him? His name, maybe, or what he did for work?" Jake paused in his work, his hand tightening around the wrench. I could see the familiar tension creep into his shoulders, the same defensive posture he'd worn that first day when I'd asked if he'd eaten. "Not much," he said carefully. "Mom always said it was complicated. That he was married to someone else when they met, and when she told him she was pregnant, he made it clear he didn't want anything to do with us." The socket wrench slipped from my fingers and clattered to the concrete floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence between us, and Jake looked up at me with concern. "You okay, Mr. Howard?" I bent to pick up the wrench, using the moment to try to steady myself. The timeline was becoming clearer, and it was making me sick to my stomach. "How old are you, Jake? Exactly, I mean." "I'll be 17 in January, January 15th. He was watching me carefully now, probably wondering why I suddenly seemed so interested in his personal details. "January 15th. I felt the blood drain from my face. That date was burned into my memory for reasons I'd tried for years to forget. It was exactly 9 months after Philip's business trip to Jacksonville, the one he'd taken alone, claiming he needed to scout out potential property investments. The trip that had lasted 2 weeks instead of the planned 5 days. The trip that had marked the beginning of a period when Philip had seemed distracted, guilty about something he wouldn't discuss. "Your mother," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. "What was her name?" Jake's expression grew more guarded. "Sarah. Sarah Morrison. Why are you asking all these questions?" "Sarah." The name hit me like a physical blow. Philip had mentioned a Sarah once, years ago, during one of his rare moments of what I'd thought was harmless flirtation. He'd been describing a waitress at some restaurant in Jacksonville, talking about how young and pretty she was, how she'd laughed at his jokes. At the time, I'd thought it was just typical male bragging, the kind of thing married men sometimes did to convince themselves they were still attractive to women. But now, looking at Jake, really looking at him, I could see it. The shape of his nose was exactly like Philip's. The way he held his mouth when he was concentrating, even the particular shade of brown in his eyes which I'd inherited from my own father and passed on to Philip. "Mr. Howard?" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're scaring me a little here. Did you know my mother or something?" I sat down heavily on an overturned crate, feeling suddenly older than my 64 years. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity, and each one made the picture more devastating. Jake wasn't just some random kid who'd wandered into my life looking for work. He was family. He was Philip's son, my grandson, abandoned and left to fend for himself while Philip lived his perfect suburban life with his legitimate children. "Jake," I said slowly, "did your mother ever mention the name Philip? Philip Brennan?" The effect of that name on Jake was immediate and dramatic. His face went white, and he took a step backward, nearly knocking over a can of motor oil. "How do you know that name?" he whispered. "Philip Brennan is my son." The socket wrench fell from Jake's hand this time, hitting the floor with a metallic clang that seemed to punctuate the moment like an exclamation point. Jake stared at me with an expression of such shock and confusion that I wanted to reach out and steady him. "That's impossible," he said. "You're lying." "I wish I was." I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the movement. "Jake, I think you might be my grandson." "No." Jake shook his head violently. "No, that can't be right. You're a good man. You gave me a job, you helped me when I had nothing. Philip Brennan is... he's..." Jake's voice cracked, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "He's what, Jake?" "He's the man who destroyed my mother's life." The words came out in a rush, like they'd been trapped inside him for years. She loved him. She really loved him, and when she told him she was pregnant, he gave her $500 and told her to take care of it. When she said she wanted to keep the baby, he told her she was on her own. He made her sign some kind of paper promising never to contact him again. The room felt like it was spinning around me. $500. The casual cruelty of it made me want to vomit. My son, the boy I'd raised to believe in honor and responsibility, had paid a pregnant woman $500 to disappear from his life. "Jake, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. She worked 2 jobs her whole life. Because of him." Jake continued, his voice rising with each word. She cleaned offices at night and waited tables during the day, and she never complained, not once. But I could see how tired she was, how hard it was for her to make ends meet, and when she got sick, when the cancer came, she couldn't afford proper treatment because she didn't have insurance. I felt tears burning my own eyes. She died because of him. She died because he was too much of a coward to take responsibility for what he'd done. Jake wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of grease across his cheek. And now you're telling me that you're his father? That makes you your grandfather. The words felt heavy in my mouth, weighted with 17 years of missed birthdays, missed Christmas mornings, missed opportunities to be part of this remarkable young man's life. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is insane. This whole situation is completely insane. Jake, please, just listen to me for a minute. Listen to what? How you're going to try to make excuses for him? How you're going to tell me he's changed, Rhea, that he's a different person now? No, I said firmly. I'm not going to make excuses for him. What he did to you and your mother was unforgivable. I'm ashamed that I raised a son capable of such cruelty. Jake stared at me for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile the grandfather he'd just discovered with the father who had abandoned him. Does he know? Jake asked finally. Does he know I exist? I thought about Philip's business trip to Jacksonville, about the guilt and distraction that had followed, about the way he'd sometimes gotten quiet when the subject of family responsibility came up. I think he does. I think he's always known. And he just let me be homeless? Let me struggle and scrape for every meal while he lived in his big house with his real family? The pain in Jake's voice was unbearable. I wanted to gather him in my arms, to try to make up for 17 years of absence, but I could see that he needed space to process this revelation. Jake, I know this is a lot to take in. I know you probably hate me right now, and I understand if you do, but please don't leave. Let me try to make this right somehow. Jake shook his head slowly. I don't hate you, Mr. Howard. You didn't know. But I can't. I need some time to think about this. He started walking toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Does he have other children? My father? 2. Twins. A boy and a girl, both 14. So I have siblings. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. Half-siblings who probably don't even know I exist. Jake, I need to go. He was already moving toward the door again. I'll see you Monday, Mr. Howard. I need some time. I watched him walk away, this grandson I'd just discovered and might have just lost, and felt a rage building in my chest that I hadn't experienced since the war. Philip hadn't just abandoned his own child. He'd robbed me of 17 years with my grandson. He'd let his own flesh and blood struggle in poverty and homelessness while he played the role of the successful family man. As Jake disappeared around the corner, I made a decision. It was time to have another conversation with my son, and this time I wasn't going to let him walk away without answers. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was uglier than anything I could have imagined, but there was more to uncover, more layers to this betrayal that I was only beginning to understand. The boy walking away from my shop wasn't just any homeless teenager I'd taken pity on. He was my grandson, and he'd been abandoned by the very son who had once stood in this same shop and accused me of being a failure. That weekend was the longest of my life. Jake had kept his word and returned to work on Monday, but something fundamental had changed between us. Where there had been easy conversation and natural rapport, now there was a careful politeness that broke my heart. He called me Mr. Howard again instead of the casual Howard he'd started using, and he avoided eye contact whenever possible. I wanted to talk to him about what we'd discovered, to try to bridge the impossible gap between being his employer and being his grandfather. But every time I started to broach the subject, I could see him tense up. So I waited, gave him space, and tried to figure out how to handle the bomb that had exploded in both our lives. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Jake had told me. The image of Sarah Morrison, young, pregnant, and abandoned, haunted me. The idea that my son had paid her $500 to disappear from his life made me physically sick, and the knowledge that my grandson had grown up in poverty while Philip lived in luxury made me angrier than I'd been since Vietnam. I needed to know more. I needed to understand the full scope of what Philip had done, both to prepare myself for the conversation I was going to have with him and to figure out how to help Jake process this devastating revelation about his family. So, on Wednesday evening, after Jake had gone home to the small apartment above Rosie's diner that I'd helped him get, I drove to the Jacksonville Public Library. I wasn't much good with computers, but the librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Chen, helped me figure out how to search through old newspaper archives and public records. What I found made my blood run cold. Sarah Morrison had been 22 when Jake was born, just a kid herself trying to make her way in the world. According to the records, she'd worked at Mulligan's Irish Pub as a waitress, the same restaurant where Philip had taken several of his business associates during his property scouting trip to Jacksonville 17 years ago. I remembered him mentioning the place, talking about how the service was exceptional. Now I understood why he'd thought the service was so exceptional. I found Sarah's address from that time period. A small apartment in a rundown part of town, the kind of place where young people lived when they were just starting out and didn't have much money. The kind of place my son could have easily swept a young waitress off her feet with talk of real estate deals and big money. But the most damning piece of evidence I found was in the legal records. A non-disclosure agreement filed with the county clerk's office, dated 3 months after Jake's birth. The document was brief and clinical, but its meaning was crystal clear. Sarah Morrison agreed never to contact Philip Brennan or his family, never to reveal his identity as the father of her child, and never to seek financial support beyond the one-time payment of $5,000. $5,000, not the $500 Jake had mentioned, $5,000. Philip had paid his pregnant girlfriend $5,000 to disappear from his life and keep quiet about his son's existence. I sat in that library for 2 hours staring at the document on the computer screen, trying to process the magnitude of my son's betrayal. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake he'd tried to make right. This was calculated, deliberate abandonment. He'd covered his tracks, made sure there would be no legal consequences, and then gone home to his pregnant wife and pretended nothing had happened. Because that was the other piece of information I'd uncovered. Sarah had given birth to Jake in January, and Philip's wife had given birth to the twins in March. Philip had been cheating on his pregnant wife with a young waitress, gotten them both pregnant at almost the same time, and then chosen to acknowledge only the children who wouldn't complicate his carefully constructed life. The drive home from Jacksonville took 2 hours, but it felt like days. I kept thinking about Jake, about all the times he must have wondered about his father, all the birthdays and holidays when he'd watched other kids with their dads and wondered why his own father had chosen not to be part of his life. I thought about Sarah, working 2 jobs to support the son that Philip had discarded like an unwanted obligation, and I thought about my own grandchildren, Emma and Jake's half-siblings, who had grown up with every advantage while their brother scrounged for survival on the streets. When I got home, I found Jake sitting on the small dock behind my house, staring out at the water. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the wooden planks, and I could see he'd been crying. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you told me, about him being my father." I sat down beside him, leaving enough space so he wouldn't feel crowded. "What have you been thinking?" I used to imagine what he was like, when I was little, before Mom got sick and everything went to hell. I used to make up stories about why he wasn't around. Maybe he was in the military and couldn't come home. Maybe he was a doctor saving lives somewhere important. Maybe he just didn't know I existed. Jake picked up a small stone and skipped it across the water. It bounced 4 times before disappearing beneath the surface. But as I got older, especially after Mom died, I started to realize the truth. He knew about me, and he just didn't care. I was an inconvenience, a complication he didn't want to deal with. Jake, and now I find out that not only is he a selfish bastard, but he's your son, who cut you off because you wouldn't sell your business, your son who was too embarrassed by your honest work to let his kids visit their grandfather. Jake turned to look at me. and I saw a maturity in his eyes that no 17-year-old should have to possess. He destroyed both our lives, didn't he? In different ways, for different reasons, but he destroyed both our lives. I wanted to argue, to find some way to defend Philip, or at least minimize his cruelty, but I couldn't. Jake was right. Philip had abandoned his own son and cut off his own father, all in service of maintaining an image that apparently mattered more to him than family. I went to Jacksonville today, I said quietly. I did some research. Jake tensed. What kind of research? I told him about the non-disclosure agreement, about the $5,000, about the timeline that showed Philip had been juggling 2 pregnant women at the same time. With each detail, I watched Jake's expression grow harder, more closed off. $5,000, he repeated when I finished. He paid my mother $5,000 to pretend I didn't exist. Jake, I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. Actually, it is. Jake's voice was surprisingly steady. It's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because now I know for sure that he's not worth wondering about anymore. He's not some tragic figure who was forced to make a difficult choice. He's just a selfish coward who values his reputation more than his own children. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the water. Finally, Jake spoke again. What are you going to do? Are you going to tell him you know? I'd been wrestling with that question ever since I'd seen the non-disclosure agreement. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Philip's house and confront him with everything I'd learned. But another part of me knew that any conversation with Philip needed to be carefully planned if it was going to accomplish anything useful. I'm going to talk to him, I said. But not yet. First, I want to make sure you're okay with whatever happens next. This affects you more than anyone. Jake was quiet for a long moment. What do you mean? I mean that Philip has other children. You're half-siblings. They're 14 now, old enough to understand what's happening. If this comes out, if Philip is forced to acknowledge you, it's going to turn their world upside down too. You think I should protect them, protect his perfect little family? I think you should decide what you want. Do you want a relationship with your father? Do you want to meet your siblings? Do you want him to face consequences for what he did to you and your mother? Or do you just want to move on with your life and leave the past behind? Jake picked up another stone, but this time he just held it, turning it over in his palm. I don't know. I honestly don't know what I want anymore. That's okay. You don't have to decide tonight, or even next week. But Jake, I want you to know something. He looked at me expectantly. Regardless of what happens with Philip, regardless of whether you want any kind of relationship with him or not, you're my grandson. You're family, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since our conversation in the shop, Jake smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. Thanks, Howard. That means a lot. And there's something else you should know. I've been thinking about updating my will, making sure the shop has a future after I'm gone. I'd like you to consider being part of that future, if you're interested. Jake's eyes widened. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're hard-working, honest, and gifted with engines. I know you care about doing good work and you treat people with respect. Most importantly, I know you're nothing like your father. Jake laughed, and this time there was genuine warmth in the sound. That might be the nicest compliment anyone's ever given me. As we sat there watching the last light fade from the sky, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope that Philip would somehow transform into the son and father he should have been, but hope that maybe some good could come from this mess. Maybe Jake and I could build something together, something that would honor his mother's memory and give both of us the family we'd been missing. But first I had to deal with Philip. I had to look my son in the eye and make him face what he'd done. The confrontation was inevitable now, and when it came, I intended to be ready. The boy sitting beside me wasn't just my employee anymore. He was my grandson, my heir, and possibly the most important person in my life. And if Philip had a problem with that, he was going to discover that there were consequences for abandoning family, consequences that had been 17 years in the making. I waited 2 more weeks before calling Philip. 2 weeks of watching Jake slowly come to terms with the reality of his parentage. 2 weeks of building up the courage to face my son with the most damning evidence of his character I could have imagined. When I finally picked up the phone on a Thursday evening, my hands were steadier than I'd expected them to be. "Philip, it's your father. We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Dad, I thought we'd settled our differences 3 years ago. I told you, this isn't about the shop. This is about Jake Morrison." The silence that followed was so complete I thought the line had gone dead. When Philip finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, dropping to a careful, guarded tone that told me everything I needed to know. "I don't know who you're talking about." "Sarah Morrison's son, your son, my grandson." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, I think you might be confused. Maybe we should—" "Philip, don't you dare try to gaslight me. I have the non-disclosure agreement. I have the payment records. I know exactly what you did 17 years ago, and I know you've been lying about it ever since." The sound of Philip exhaling was audible through the phone. "Where did you get that information?" "That's not the important question. The important question is how you could abandon your own child and let him grow up homeless while you played happy family with your legitimate kids." "Dad, you don't understand the situation." "Then explain it to me. Come to the shop tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. And Philip, don't even think about not showing up, because if you don't, I'll be driving to your house to have this conversation in front of Sarah and the twins." I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anticipation. After 3 years of silence, after 3 years of being cut out of his life, because I wouldn't abandon my principles, Philip was finally going to have to face the consequences of his choices. The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Jake seemed to sense my tension, asking twice if everything was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him about the planned confrontation. This was something I needed to handle alone first, to gauge Philip's reaction and figure out the best way to move forward. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of Philip's BMW pulling into the gravel parking lot outside the shop. I watched through the window as he sat in his car for nearly 5 minutes, probably trying to decide whether to drive away or come inside and face the music. Eventually, he got out and walked slowly toward the shop, his shoulders set in the defensive posture I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have. "Dad." He nodded as he stepped inside, his eyes automatically scanning the shop like he was looking for hidden threats. "Philip." I didn't get up from my chair behind the desk. "Thank you for coming. Let's just get this over with. What exactly do you think you know?" I pulled out a manila folder I'd prepared, containing copies of all the documents I'd found during my research. "I know that 17 years ago you had an affair with a 22-year-old waitress named Sarah Morrison while your wife was pregnant with the twins. I know that Sarah got pregnant and gave birth to a son on January 15th, and I know that you paid her $5,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear from your life." Philip's face had gone pale, but his expression remained defiant. "Even if that's true, what business is it of yours?" "That boy, your son, has been working for me for over a month. He's been homeless, Philip. His mother died of cancer last year because she couldn't afford proper medical treatment, and he's been living on the streets ever since. That's not my problem." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. "Not your problem, he's your child." "He's the result of a mistake I made as a young man. I dealt with it appropriately at the time." "Appropriately?" I stood up, my chair scraping against the concrete floor. "You call abandoning your pregnant girlfriend and forcing her to raise your child alone dealing with it appropriately?" Philip straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "I was 26 years old, Dad. I had a pregnant wife, a new business, a whole life ahead of me. I couldn't let one mistake destroy everything I'd worked for. So you destroyed their lives instead. I gave her $5,000. That was more than generous under the circumstances." $5,000 to raise a child for 18 years? To cover medical bills, school expenses, food, clothing, everything a growing boy needs? You think $5,000 was generous? Philip's jaw tightened. She had options. She chose to keep the baby against my advice. That was her decision to make, and she had to live with the consequences. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised to believe in honor and responsibility, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. Against your advice? You mean you told her to get an abortion? I told her to be practical. We both knew I wasn't going to leave my wife and legitimate children for some waitress I'd known for 2 months. Jesus Christ, Philip, do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying? I'm saying I made a rational decision based on the circumstances. Sarah knew I was married when we started seeing each other. She knew the situation wasn't going to end with us riding off into the sunset together. I walked over to where Philip was standing, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead despite his attempts to appear calm. And what about after your son was born? What about when Sarah was struggling to make ends meet? What about when she got sick and couldn't work? Did you ever once think about checking on them, about making sure your child was okay? Philip's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or shame, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I kept track of them for a few years, made sure they were surviving. You kept track of them? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. You mean you knew when your son was struggling, when his mother was dying, when he ended up homeless, and you did nothing? What was I supposed to do? Show up and disrupt everyone's lives? Destroy my marriage and confuse my legitimate children? You were supposed to take care of your child. I have children, Dad. Emma and Jake. My real children. I have responsibilities to them, to Sarah, to the life I've built. I couldn't let some teenage mistake from 20 years ago destroy all of that. The way he said real children made my blood boil. Jake is your real child, too. He's your flesh and blood, your firstborn son, and you threw him away like garbage. I made a difficult choice in an impossible situation. No, Philip. You made a selfish choice in a situation you created, and now that boy, your son, my grandson, is working in this shop trying to rebuild his life from nothing while you live in your big house with your perfect family. Philip was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I was finally getting through to him. Maybe some small part of the decent man I'd tried to raise was still alive somewhere inside him. But when he spoke again, his voice was colder than ever. What do you want from me, Dad? Money? Do you want me to start sending him checks so you can feel better about this situation? I want you to acknowledge him. I want you to take responsibility for what you've done. I want you to be the father you should have been 17 years ago. Philip laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's not going to happen. I have a life, a reputation, a business to protect. I'm not going to blow up everything I've worked for because you've developed some sentimental attachment to a homeless kid. That homeless kid is your son. That homeless kid is a reminder of the biggest mistake I ever made, and I dealt with that mistake a long time ago. The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. I looked at my son, this man who had once been a little boy who cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant, who had begged me to save every injured bird we found in our backyard, and realized that I didn't know him at all. Maybe I never had. Get out, I said quietly. Dad, get out of my shop, get out of my life, and don't you ever come back. Philip straightened his tie again, smoothing down his expensive suit. You're making a mistake, Dad. You're throwing away your relationship with your real family for some stranger who means nothing to you. Jake means everything to me, more than you ever will again. Philip walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Just before he reached it, he turned back one final time. When this all falls apart, when your little charity case disappoints you or moves on to something better, don't come crawling back to me looking for forgiveness. I won't be there. Good, I said, because I'll never forgive you for this. The door slammed shut behind him, and I was alone with the weight of what I'd just learned. Philip hadn't just abandoned his son out of fear or immaturity. He had done it deliberately, calculating the cost to his reputation and deciding that his own comfort was worth more than his child's welfare. But as devastating as the confrontation had been, it had also clarified something important for me. I knew now exactly where I stood, and exactly what I needed to do next. Jake deserved to know the truth about his father, all of it, and then we could decide together how to move forward, how to build a family that was based on love and respect rather than shame and abandonment. The boy Philip had discarded was about to inherit everything Philip had once demanded I give up, and somehow that felt exactly like justice. The morning after my confrontation with Philip, I found Jake already at work when I arrived at the shop. He was bent over the engine of a small sailboat, his movements precise and confident as he adjusted the timing belt. Watching him work, seeing the careful attention he paid to every detail, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with blood relations and everything to do with the character of the young man he'd become despite the circumstances of his upbringing. "You're here early," I said, hanging my keys on the hook by the door. "Couldn't sleep much last night." Jake looked up from his work and I could see dark circles under his eyes. "I kept thinking about everything we talked about him. Did you call him?" I had planned to ease into the subject to find the right moment to tell Jake about the confrontation, but looking at his expectant face, I realized there was no gentle way to share what I'd learned. "I did more than call him. He was here last night." Jake straightened up completely, setting down his wrench. "He came here? To the shop? We had a conversation about you, about what he did to you and your mother." I walked over to my desk and sat down, suddenly feeling every one of my 64 years. "Jake, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear." Over the next 20 minutes, I told Jake everything. About Philip's complete lack of remorse, about his dismissal of Jake as a mistake, about his admission that he'd kept track of them over the years but chosen to do nothing even when he knew they were struggling. I watched Jake's expression grow harder with each revelation, saw his jaw clench when I repeated Philip's words about his real children. When I finished, Jake was quiet for a long time. He walked over to the small window that looked out over the marina, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "So he knew," Jake said finally. "All these years, when I was wondering why my father never came looking for me, when I was angry at my mother for not trying harder to find him, he knew exactly where we were, and just didn't care." "I'm sorry, Jake. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Jake turned back to me, and I was surprised to see that he looked more relieved than devastated. "Actually, it is what I wanted to hear. Not the part about him knowing we were struggling. That's just cruel. But the part about him not wanting anything to do with me now, because it means I don't have to wonder anymore what it would be like to have a relationship with him." "You don't?" "Howard, the man you described to me isn't someone I'd want as a father even if he begged me to be part of his life. Any man who can abandon his own child and feel good about it, who can let that child's mother die from lack of medical care and sleep soundly at night, that's not someone I want to know." Jake walked back over to where I was sitting, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "But there's something I do want to know. You said he cut you off because you wouldn't sell this place, because he was embarrassed by what you do for a living. Is that true?" "It's true. And now you know that while he was judging you for being an honest working man, he was hiding the fact that he'd abandoned his own son. Doesn't that make you angry?" I considered the question carefully. "It makes me sad. Sad that I raised a son who values image over integrity. Sad that I failed him somehow in teaching him what really matters in life. But angry? No, not anymore." "Why not?" "Because if he hadn't cut me off, if he hadn't demanded that I sell this shop, you never would have found your way here. And meeting you, getting to know you, discovering that I have a grandson who embodies everything I tried to teach Philip about honor and hard work, that's worth more than any relationship with him could ever be." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since our conversation about his parentage. "So what happens now?" I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick legal document that I'd had my lawyer prepare the week before. "Now we make this official. I'm updating my will, Jake. When I die, this shop, my house, everything I own, it's all going to you." Jake's eyes widened as he took the document from my hands. "Howard, you can't do this. You barely know me." I know everything I need to know. I know you show up early and work late without being asked. I know you treat our customers with respect, regardless of whether they pay in cash or fish. I know you have a natural talent for this work and a genuine love for it. Most importantly, I know you understand what this place really means. But what about your other grandchildren, Philip's kids? Don't they deserve something? I shook my head. They'll inherit whatever Philip leaves them, which I imagine will be considerable. But this shop, this legacy, it belongs to someone who understands its value, who won't tear it down to build condominiums or sell it to the highest bidder. It belongs to family, and you're my family. Jake was quiet for a moment, scanning through the legal document. This says I'd inherit everything immediately if something happened to you, but that I'm also named as your business partner starting immediately. What does that mean? It means we're officially partners now, 50-50. It means your name goes on the sign outside, and it means you have equal say in every decision we make about this place's future. Howard, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it. Say you'll help me build something here that will last long after both of us are gone. Jake set the document down on my desk and looked around the shop, at the boats in various stages of repair, at the tools we'd organized together, at the photographs of satisfied customers that covered one wall. When he looked back at me, there were tears in his eyes. I accept, but only if you let me do something in return. What's that? Let me pay for a proper headstone for my mother's grave. She's buried in a county cemetery with just a wooden marker that's starting to rot. She deserves better than that. We'll do it together, I said, and we'll make sure it says, beloved mother of Jake Morrison, cherished grandmother to his children, because she's going to be a grandmother someday, and those children are going to know exactly how strong and brave their grandmother was. 2 months later, Philip showed up at the shop unannounced. I was in the office working on invoices when I heard his BMW pull into the parking lot, and I felt my stomach tighten with apprehension. Through the window, I could see him sitting in his car, talking on his phone, probably working up the courage to come inside. Jake was under the hood of Captain Rodriguez's boat when Philip finally entered the shop. I watched my son's eyes scan the interior, taking in the improvements we'd made, the new paint, the organized tool walls, the professional-looking sign that read Morrison and Brennan Marine Repair. Dad, Philip said, his voice carefully neutral, I heard you'd taken on a partner. Philip, I didn't get up from my desk. What do you want? His gaze moved to Jake, who had straightened up and was watching the interaction with obvious curiosity. For a moment, Philip just stared at him, and I could see the recognition in his eyes, the acknowledgement of shared features that couldn't be denied. So this is him, Philip said quietly. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to where we were standing. He was nearly as tall as Philip now, with the same strong jaw and confident bearing, but there was something in his eyes that Philip had never possessed, genuine warmth and integrity. You must be Philip, Jake said, extending his hand. I've heard a lot about you. Philip hesitated before shaking Jake's hand, and I could see him struggling with emotions he didn't know how to process. You look like... Philip started, then stopped. Like you, Jake finished. Yeah, I get that. But that's about all we have in common. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Philip's jaw tightened, and I could see his automatic defensive response kicking in. Look, I don't know what my father has told you about our situation, but... He told me the truth, Jake interrupted. That you abandoned me and my mother, that you paid her to disappear, and that you've known all along that I existed, but chose to ignore me because I wasn't convenient for your perfect life. Philip's face flushed red. You don't understand the complexity of the situation. I understand perfectly. You're a coward who values his reputation more than his own children. Jake's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, which somehow made the words even more devastating. But that's okay, because I don't need you. I already have a father figure who actually cares about me. Philip looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like regret in his eyes. Dad, surely you can see that this is a mistake. This boy, he's manipulating you, using your guilt to get access to what should be your legitimate grandchildren's inheritance. Jake laughed, but there was no malice in it. You know what's funny? You're so obsessed with money and inheritance that you can't imagine someone might actually care about something else. Your father and I aren't partners because of money. We're partners because we both understand what it means to work hard, to treat people with respect, to build something that matters. And you think fixing boats matters? I think honest work matters. I think treating people fairly matters. I think being there for your family matters. Jake stepped closer to Philip, and I could see the steel in his spine, the strength that poverty and abandonment had forged in him. All things you never learned. Philip turned back to me one last time. This isn't over, Dad. When you realize what a mistake you've made, when this boy breaks your heart the way I know he will, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces. The only one who broke my heart was you, I said quietly. And you did it long before I ever met Jake. After Philip left, Jake and I worked in comfortable silence for the rest of the afternoon, as the sun was setting over the marina, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the sunsets Maria and I used to watch together. Jake spoke up. Do you think he'll ever understand what he threw away? I considered the question carefully. Maybe someday. When his perfect life isn't so perfect anymore, when his legitimate children grow up and see him for what he really is, maybe he'll realize that the son he abandoned turned out to be everything he should have been. Jake nodded thoughtfully. And what about Emma and Jake? His twins? Do you think they'll ever want to know me? I don't know. But if they do, if they ever come looking for their older brother, they'll find someone they can be proud of. Someone who took everything life threw at him and came out stronger. Someone who knows the value of family because he had to build his own. That night, as I locked up the shop and headed home to the small house where I'd lived alone for 5 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Maria died. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense that my life had meaning again, that the legacy I was building would outlast me. Jake Morrison, my grandson, my partner, my heir, had given me something more valuable than Philip ever could have. He'd given me hope that the values I believed in still mattered, that hard work and integrity could still triumph over selfishness and greed. And somewhere in Jacksonville there was a headstone with Sarah Morrison's name on it that would ensure her sacrifice was never forgotten, that her son would always remember where he came from and what she'd given up to raise him right. The boy Philip had discarded like trash had become the man who would carry on everything Philip had been too proud to value. And that, I thought as I watched the lights of the marina twinkle in the darkness, was exactly the kind of justice the world needed more of.